Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Today on the program, we'll be joined by City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt. I'll provide an overview of Kendra Brooks's wealth tax, and Denise Clay Murray will give us a preview of her weekly column that will be out in the Hall Monitor Weekly Dispatch this Friday. So, before we get started, I'd like to introduce Denise Clay Murray.
You can't see me right now because I'm having a slight issue with my camera.
All
As
right.
soon as I get that straightened out, I will be more than you can see what it looks like to work from home on a Wednesday.
There
How
you
you
go.
doing, Larry?
I'm all right, Denise. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. We have a
Okay.
pretty decent show tonight. Where we have,
Unlike the other ones.
yeah. Well, no, I mean, we always have a decent show, but we're talking tonight to another one of the many people who are either official or unofficial mayoral candidates in Controller Rebecca Reinhardt, and we talked a little bit about a report she issued on how the city's money for anti-violence programs is being spent, and considering the fact that last night a 14-year-old boy lost his life, and five of his fellow teammates in a Roxborough High School football team were injured due to gun violence. It's something that's really relevant, and I'm glad that we're going to be able to have a few minutes to talk about what the city is doing with the money and whether it's the right thing or even the thing that makes sense. So we'll take a moment, and everybody, please enjoy this interview that Larry and I did with Rebecca Reinhardt here on Hall Monitor. Good evening and welcome to Hall Monitor. I'm Denise Clay Murray here with Larry McGlynn, co-hosting tonight. And we have with us Rebecca Reinhardt, the controller for the city of Philadelphia, otherwise known as the person that tells you where your money is going and whether or not it's making the most sense. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Well, I guess my first question, because one of the things that I've been following is the $155 million that the city put in the budget regarding gun violence and the chunk that was supposed to go to community organizations. I saw a recent report that talked about how this plan does not appear to be going the way that the city told us it was going to be going when they started doing community grants. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So my office, starting last year, looked at the 155 million that you just mentioned in anti-violence budgeted funding that the mayor's budget had included in it. And what we found over a year ago was that out of the 155 million, very little of it, only about 21%, was going to what is called intervention work, but that is the type of anti-violence work that has an impact within 1 to 3 years. So intervention work is, by leading experts in anti-violence, considered to be what stops the bloodshed now. Then there's additional types of anti-violence programming that's, by leading experts, put into buckets of prevention and transformation. So prevention and transformation are good programs. They're after-school programs, they're economic development, they're good, but they're not going to stop the shooting right now, which is what we need here to be funded at an appropriate level. That's the intervention work. So that was over a year ago. Now, fast forward to now, but recently my office looked at the 200 or so million that the mayor budgeted for anti-violence work this year. The mayor and city council's approved budget. And what we found was very similar to last year. That very little of it, only 17% this year, is going to these intervention strategies. And by intervention strategies, they're very specific work to focus on the people most likely to shoot or be shot, looking at it as a public health issue, and having intervention with those individuals to pull them out of that life of violence and to have them drop the guns. If they don't drop the guns, then there are consequences. But what has been found across the country, in Oakland, in New Orleans, Chicago, New York, LA, is that these programs are so successful and they decrease homicide rates dramatically, and are expected to have results within 1 year. So I say all that because the lack of focus on these intervention programs is very problematic. And then the second thing is that there isn't, right now from the mayor's administration, there isn't program evaluation, at least any that's been disclosed to the public, to say, is this funding working? Is this spending working to get at this violence that we're seeing right now?
Now, if only 21 and 17% of that money is going into intervention, where is the rest of it going?
So it's going towards these to programs that are categorized as prevention and transformation. So it's everything from, after school programs to just increasing the budgets, for example, of Parks and Rec and Library to make up for a portion of their pandemic related cuts. The mayor's administration put that into this pot of money. There's a lot in this pot of money that, and I say pot of money, but in this 155 million last year, 200 million this year, that isn't specifically focused on stopping the violence right now. It could be good to fund. I've been a big proponent of having library service go to 6 days a week, having after school programming. And in fact, I worked with Councilmember Gautier last year to demand from the mayor to focus on the 14 zip codes out of about 40 zip codes in our city that are most impacted by violence, and increase library hours, increase rec center programming. But that has to be done at the same time as the intervention work. But the intervention work is what works to get the violence down immediately. It needs to be funded at much higher levels.
Now, what I found most fascinating about the report is the fact that as part of the grants that were supposed to go to community groups, so that they could expand and scale up programs, one of the things that was supposed to be a part of that was they were supposed to have someone who was there that they could talk to about how to use this large pot of money that they were just given in a way that is the most effective and efficient. And apparently that's not happening. So I guess, what are you seeing from these community groups that are being handed, in some cases, $50,000 to $100,000 with no idea of how they're supposed to use it the most efficiently?
Well, the way the process was supposed to work was to have some rigor around what the groups were doing with the money and the outcomes that were anticipated. I think that some of the groups just got the money, even though it was budgeted a long time ago. But there's been many problems associated with the city's management of those community organization grants. And I think that community groups are important in getting money and programming into people's hands and homes, right, that need help. But at the same time, there needs to be program evaluation. So the city should be looking at, okay, how is this money spent? how well was that spent? What were the outcomes? How many people were reached? Did it reduce gun violence in the way in which that group said they were going to? So I think that type of program evaluation is what does not appear to be occurring across the board with the anti-violence spending that the city's making. And there's just a lack of transparency around it. I mean, my office put a request in back in May to the Office of Violence Prevention for information around the spending, the community groups given money, and also just the broader anti-violence spending. The community groups are one small subset of that, but there's hundreds of millions of dollars that's being spent, and there's no measurement of that. And the thing is that the gun violence is devastating our city right now, and there are solutions. I mean, this is fixable, and that's what we've seen in other cities across the country. And New York City and LA, for example, fund intervention work at about $24,000 to $26,000 per shooting, while Philadelphia only funds it at $6,000 per shooting. So we need, as a city, to fully fund the strategies that work and then measure how they're working, because experts in the field, there's a Harvard researcher, Thomas Apt, who says that if these intervention programs, if done right, at the end of year one, will reduce the homicide rate by 10%. So that's what other cities have seen. So we need to be on a different track, and it's just devastating what's happening right now.
I didn't realize we actually spent so little per shooting regarding intervention and different things to try to stop this, because you would think that as much as we talk about it,
right,
that we were spending a lot more money, and it's just really kind of odd to hear that we're not.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things we need to do as a city, and I've been vocal on this, is that we need to put the care into the programs and the strategies that work. And that includes funding them appropriately, as well as making sure that they're working as they intend to. And I'm the fiscal watchdog, and here I am saying we actually need to fund these things more. And the reason we need to fund them more at higher levels is because that's how you get them to work, to fund them appropriately. They're not, and then to administer them appropriately. These programs, the strategies of reaching out to the specific individuals that are most at risk of gun violence and saying there's a high probability that you're either going to get shot or shoot someone in the next year, and we want to offer you a way out of this lifestyle. And it's done through a life coach model where someone with the same lived experience is their life coach. And it offers them a way out, opportunity. They're coupled with talk therapy. Chicago's Becoming a Man program has been tremendously successful. So I say all this that we need to be smart about how we're spending, and smart sometimes means more. And this is something that we need to fund more, and do it right, and stop just saying, oh, we increased it by a few million. What we need to do is fund it right for the level of the crisis that the city is facing. And right now we have money. The city of Philadelphia has a lot of money. And I don't say that lightly, but there's the American Rescue Plan money that Biden and Congress approved that has given the city $1.4 billion extra that to be utilized. So there is funding right now. We have to be strategic in how it's used.
Okay, now, has council or the mayor's office seen this report? And if so, what kind of response have you gotten to it?
Yeah, so the council and the mayor's office has seen the report and the analysis. some council members are very supportive of this. And I think, from the mayor's administration, I haven't heard much from it, unfortunately.
Wow. So let me just ask like a question that kind of looks ahead a little bit.
Sure.
The person who becomes the next mayor will probably have access to these reports and different things that, that your office has done regarding gun violence and stuff, because it's sure to be a lead issue on the campaign trail.
Yeah.
Have any of the people who are currently running reached out to you? And if you had advice for the next mayor on what to do with this problem, what would it be?
Well, I think that the intervention strategies are key, that we need to fund and implement the intervention strategies that work. We need to invest in our communities. And there is also a component around getting the illegal guns off the streets.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over now to Larry McGlynn, my co-host for here on Hall Monitor, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM.
Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. And thank you, Controller Reinhardt, for being with us.
Sure.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit to something we've been hearing about since May, property assessments. And in 2019, your office found that the assessments in the poorer areas of the city had the least accurate assessments. And that hasn't really changed since then. Do you have any insight as to why we're still having these problems?
That is a very good question. And back in 2019, my office did analysis around the accuracy of the city's property assessments. And we found exactly what you just mentioned, Larry, that the mayor's administration has said historically that the assessments meet accuracy standards citywide. But what we found was that when you look at it by geographic zone, by neighborhood, that the poorest areas of our city are paying more than their fair share. So that areas of Northwest, Southwest Philadelphia are overassessed compared to sales value, which is not fair and not right. And so in 2019, when my office found this and we put it out there, my feeling was at the time, well, of course they're going to fix this. This is unfair. This is unjust. And it's likely based in decades and decades of racist history in the city and country, and it must be fixed. But we didn't hear anything around it. And then with this new assessment coming out this past year, we looked at it again and it's still the same issue. So property tax, the assessments went up over 30%, but the underlying issue, the underlying inequity was not fixed. And it's completely not right. And it should be, and it can be, it must be. The status quo is maddening, actually, on this.
It really sort of boggles the mind. Do you have any insight, or your office have any insight into the methodology behind the assessments?
Well, there's not as much transparency as there should be with the assessments, and that's an issue that they've made. The Office of Property Assessment has made some improvement on transparency, but nowhere near enough in terms of the methodology. And it's really unclear what they're fully doing, honestly. And this is not acceptable and should be fixed. There's sort of the continuation of the status quo seems to be accepted, which shouldn't be and needs to be disrupted.
So without having the I guess proprietary information about how they do the assessments, in your opinion, is there a better way to do this that makes it more equitable for people, and is a more reliable way to handle this?
Well, the Office of Property Assessment should be looking at accuracy by geographic zone. And there's measures that are used called uniformity, regressivity. It gets pretty technical, but they should be looking at each geographic zone, each neighborhood in the city, and saying, okay, we're not meeting standards here. What do we need to do to fix this? There should be an action plan with each area to make them more accurate. It seems that that's just not happening. So that's what should happen, because what we shouldn't see is what we have now, which is that North, South, West, and West Philadelphia are paying more than their fair share. And my office has seen this type of inequity in a lot of service delivery, which I mean, I know this isn't what we're talking about today, but my office looked at on-time trash collection, for example, and found that before the pandemic, in the years leading up to the pandemic, the on-time trash collection rate was over 90% in Center City, Philadelphia, and Northeast Philadelphia, while only 65 to 75% in West, North, and South Philly. So this type of inequity, like here we are overtaxing residents in Northwest and Southwest from property taxes, and under delivering in service delivery, such as trash collection. That's based on, again, racist policies. And to me, that needs to be changed right away. That needs to be immediately fixed.
Right, because the only key differences there are income and skin color. Like that's what we're talking about, and we hear that too. And it's like you said, it's with a lot of things, not even talking about the schools. I mean, there's so many different things there. So that kind of leads to the next thing. And this is general because this isn't necessarily your office's purview, but in a way, is there anything the city can be doing to be more efficient in the way it handles not just the issues we've talked about, but different things that create inequity and poverty in general?
Well, I think that there's so much more that the city could be doing to create more equitable service delivery and create opportunity. I mean, this starts with each service delivery and saying, okay, where are the inequities? We just talked about trash collection and property and assessments for property taxes. We should be looking at each service and saying, okay, why did these neighborhoods not get the same service delivery? Illegal dumping, for example, and cleaning up and enforcing on illegal dumping. Everyone deserves to have clean streets. And education, we haven't touched upon education being a huge inequity. So I think what we need is city leadership, a mayor's office that says this isn't acceptable. We're going to completely transform this so that we are fully taking care of every resident.
All right, I'd like to turn it over to Denise Clay-Murray here on Hall Monitor.
Thank you, Controller Reinhardt, for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh,
is there any new reports that you all are working on right now that folks might want to keep an eye out on? And also, where can people get a copy of the reports that we just mentioned?
Sure. So the reports are all on my office's website at controller.phila.gov, and that's controller.phila.gov. And in terms of upcoming reports, we do have an audit of the police department coming out in the next few weeks.
Oh.
So what we've looked at there is, was originally a request from city council members to do for my office to do a deep dive into how police spends over $750 million a year. How is that money utilized? And this is the audit of that. And it is coming out soon. And I think that's one that will be very important.
Okay, we'll have to have you back on when that's released.
Absolutely.
One final question, and it's a question that we've been asking everybody, because, whether we like it or not, the 2023 mayor's race has, for all intents and purposes, started. What are you looking for in the next mayor?
I think someone with the experience to lead and the compassion and empathy to be the leader the city needs. The city is in such a critical moment right now. The problems are solvable. Absolutely, they're solvable. But Philly needs a leader that cares, an experienced city leader that can fix things and that cares deeply about everyone in our city.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And like I said, we'll have to have you back on when the police audit is done.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the conversation.
Okay, you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. We'd like to thank Controller Reinhardt for being with us. And Denise, a lot happened in that conversation with Controller Reinhardt. Well, what stood out to you the most?
The thing that is still sticking out to me is the fact that the city has given community groups, many of which were mom and pop, large sums of money and no guidance. Yeah. That is still the part that is sticking out to me, because it's basically setting these organizations that do vital and important work and have done so traditionally on a shoestring up to fail. And in this case, being set up to fail with money that you got from city agencies can lead to you ending up in federal court. So I hope that at the very least, the city takes a look at the fact that these people aren't getting the mentoring that they're supposed to get and actually starts to provide it for them, because it's not fair. All these folks want to do is help the kids in their neighborhood deal with the trauma that literally surrounds them every day in the form of shootings and murders and stuff. And they want to make sure that there's not another generation of trauma. So you have the kind of things that are going on now continuing to go on. Do right by these people. They've been working hard on their own and taking money out of their own pocket. If you're going to give them a pool of money to use, to expand their work, at least make sure that they can do it in a way that doesn't lead to them ending up, doing 5 years in federal prison.
Well, and I think it was you actually, when they announced that they were doing this at a press conference, you asked, is there going to be guidance for these organizations to learn, to use this amount of money? And we were told, yes, that's going to be available.
Which is kind of what angers me about what the controller found out. Because you said on the record that there would be guidance, and there is no guidance, which means either something got mixed up or you misled the citizens of Philadelphia on something that they really can't afford to be misled on. So, something has to change with that. Or like I said, one of these mom and pop agencies that finally has enough money to fund all of its programs is going to get in trouble because somebody who doesn't realize that they're misusing the money is going to misuse the money, and that's going to be an issue.
Right. And you can misuse money in a good faith way. You don't realize that this bucket of money is only for this specific purpose, and you use it
Right,
for another legitimate purpose.
right,
That's technically illegal. It can be construed as illegal, and
right.
it's just an accident.
Right. If you're one of these organizations and someone gets shot and killed, and a mother comes to you and she doesn't have any money to bury her child, the compassionate part of you is going to say, okay, well, I got this pot of money.
Mhm.
I'm going to take some of this pot of money and I'm going to use it to help this woman give her child a proper funeral. And then next thing you know, you're being audited and you've got FBI agents in your face saying that this like $9,000 to $10,000, because that's what a funeral is going for these days. This $9,000 to $10,000 that you spent to help this family start the process of moving on and moving along with their lives and coming to some sort of middle, because there really is no way to get over the loss of a child. It just does not happen. But you're helping this family at least get to a place where they can find their new normal, and you're about to get sent to jail for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could be a very big problem very soon for a lot of well-intentioned organizations trying to do the right thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So the city needs, the Office of Violence Prevention needs to do its job and make sure that these people are getting what they need to spend this money that they're getting.
Yeah. Mm. So a couple of interesting things happened last week and this week. The first of which that I want to talk a little bit about. Councilmember Kendra Brooks held what she called the People's Hearing outside of City Hall last week, talking about her wealth tax proposal.
Mhm.
And this is something I found very interesting. And I have a slideshow.
All
I'll see
right.
if I can make it work here. There it is. All right. So why a wealth tax? Why would we do this, right? And there's a lot of reasons, both historical and present day, that kind of factor into this. But just to tell you very briefly what this is about, Councilmember Brooks's bill would tax 4% of what we could call passive income, stocks, bonds, things like that. Okay. So for every $1,000 somebody makes in the stock market, something like that, you would give $4 to the city, except if it's like a retirement account or something like that. Okay. So there are stipulations, but basically it's to tax wealth, and the kind of wealth that you earn, not necessarily by doing anything. So a very interesting proposal. And one of the speakers at that event was Jeff Garris, who was the Federal Campaigns and Program Director for the Keystone Research Center and PA Budget and Policy Center.
Mhm.
And I spoke to Mr. Garris a little earlier today because I thought some of his insight could like sort of fit in with my PowerPoint here. So what I'd like to play, I'm going to intersperse a couple of things here. And the first one I'd like to play is like, why would we do this? So
Mhm.
here's Mr. Garris explaining why this makes sense.
Okay.
That we have seen in our research here in Pennsylvania, and what we continue to see in the research from national organizations that really look into the whole question of tax fairness, is that we see that some very, very rich people, billionaires, folks who are close to being billionaires, often pay much, much lower effective tax rates on their wealth that they're living off of, much lower rates than folks who are working at jobs paying income tax on wages are paying. So we think on a basic level of fairness, it's critically important that we make sure that everyone's doing their fair share. And the problem is that it's basically very, very wealthy who have consistently not been doing their fair share. So, these are important issues for taxpayers, looking at federal, state, and local. Here at the local level, we can see that there's tremendous needs that are going unmet in Philadelphia. We have significant problems with the safety and basic health of some of our school buildings where we have children and teachers and other support staff going in day after day into buildings that have toxic conditions. And it's going to be very costly to repair and fix all of these buildings, get buildings up to just basic safety and health levels in Philadelphia, let alone, the kind of environments that would help to foster greater learning and education. So, and that's just looking in one area. We have tremendous problems with poverty in Philadelphia. We have a lot of challenges in terms of our infrastructure, roads, bridges. There's relief and assistance coming from the federal government through this infrastructure package that was passed last year. But there are a lot of needs here, and a lot of bridges and streets and roads and critical infrastructure, water, gas, sewer that really have been neglected for quite a long time. And that's why right now is a critically important time to raise the kind of revenue to be able to make those kinds of investments in the common good. One of the ways we do that is by making sure that the very, very wealthy are paying at least their fair share. And we can make the case, maybe they should even be paying more than the typical taxpayer. But we think this is an important place to start to make the kind of revenue generation that we need to make these important investments.
So let me bring my slideshow back if I can. There we go. So let's start with this. How did we get here? I think when we talk about the tax structure of the city of Philadelphia, it starts 40 years ago, the issues that we're seeing now. Mm-hmm. So not just with municipal finance, but just in general, right? So Ronald Reagan gets in office in 1981, and he cuts the tax rates on the wealthy from 70 to 50% in 81, and then 5 years later down to 28%. It's an amazing reduction in the responsibility of the wealthiest people, and that puts the burden on the middle class.
Or what was left of the middle class after Reagan got done with it.
That's right. In those first couple of years, he reduced federal revenues by 9%. And we're talking billions of dollars. The deficit increased. And the deficit doesn't concern me as much as it concerns other people. And I have reasons for that, which I could explain, on another show. So they eventually had to raise taxes again. Right after that, because they made a mistake. The interest rates are around 20%. We were talking about interest rate hikes now. Imagine what it was like back then. And inflation was around 10%. All right. So now you're starting to see what happened with federal revenue. And here's why that's really important. My PowerPoint's a little messed up, but that's okay. The next thing that happens, we have this reduction in federal revenue. So what do we do next? The federal government cut subsidies to cities. And I found this in a Washington Post article from 1982. Philadelphia, beset by unemployment, strikes, and shrinking public services, lost more than half of its $100 million in federal job training money and $6 million in general revenue sharing because its population had declined. The city has struggled to keep some of the workers formerly paid out of federal jobs training funds, adding to its financial pinch. That's just one small part of the puzzle. We're talking about people who are looking for jobs, and that money's being cut. That has a ripple effect upon everything. But what's even more crucial, Philadelphia in the 1980s saw a 40% decline in federal aid. 40% of the funds that we were getting from the federal government disappeared in the 1980s. So we have this notion now, and this is what this economic policy was built on, cutting the taxes from the wealthy, and the idea is it would trickle down and fill the gaps created by the lost revenue and the revenue we took away from cities. And here's Jeff Garris again talking about that idea of trickle-down economics.
If you look at, corporate wealth, Comcast headquartered here in Philadelphia, some of the large universities and hospitals, now those are not for-profit companies, but those, are places where we're seeing, a lot of, land not being taxed locally, which is really important for investments in schools. So, the whole PICA is obviously something that's critically important as well. So, we just, we think on a basic fairness level, the wealthy should be paying their fair share, and they can afford to, and they've benefited from, as you pointed out, 4 decades of, trickle-down economics, which we look at 4 decades later. Where are we? Well, average wages have stagnated or have decreased. Costs of housing, costs of education have skyrocketed. And we wonder, well, when is this going to work? If this was going to work, this would have worked a long time ago. I think in reality, though, the truth is trickle-down economics did exactly what the people who were designing it intended it to do, which was to redistribute wealth to the wealthiest individuals and corporations in the country. And now we're paying the consequences of that. We've seen, neglect of our infrastructure, not making investments. It sometimes is astounding that, it's fiscal conservatives sometimes who are doing some of these things where, these are the folks who should be realizing that, you get what you pay for. When we don't make important investments, we end up seeing the quality of things go downhill. And we've seen that in just a whole host of ways. And we're also facing a really serious affordable housing crisis here in Philadelphia. And this is not just Philadelphia, across the state and across the country. If we don't start coming up with some solutions to this, we're going to see these kinds of problems get even worse. And that's why we think it's time for the wealthy to pay their fair share. They should be, they should be paying taxes on their wealth the way that workers pay taxes on their wages. So.
Now, we see what's happened in the 80s. So what happened in the 1990s up until now? Well, the tax rate went up a little bit. The highest tax rate goes up to 39.6%. It goes up a little bit more to 43%. And now we're back down to 37%. All right. So at the end of the 1980s, Philadelphia is left with a massive budget shortfall. Now, not all of that can be attributed to what happened in the 80s with our federal subsidies being cut and the tax rate being changed. Philadelphia was mismanaged in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And then in the 80s and 90s, you start to pay for that. So one of the things the city has to do is borrow money to help fill its budget holes. The city at the time, and we've spoken about this on the show, did not have a good credit rating. So it was basically junk bond status at the time. The Commonwealth, on the other hand, had a very good credit rating. So the state said to Philadelphia, we will borrow the money for you. However, you're going to pay it back, and you're going to let us have oversight over your budget, which is what PICA is, the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, which still exists today. That money is still being paid off. That money we borrowed in the early 90s, we are still paying off now.
Wow, it's 2022.
Yeah, it'll be until 2024 that money will not be paid back in full. It's not just the fact that we're paying back money, but it's also the interest on the payments, where that money could be doing other things in our city. So we were kind of squeezed. Some of it was our own fault, but a lot of it was because you saw, our assistance being cut out and the middle class being stepped on for these tax cuts. But it wasn't always that way. There were historically taxes on wealth, and Mr. Garris is going to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, as we pointed out, this was the case in a lot of counties here in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia had something very similar to this. And these things got phased out a couple of decades ago. So, if you want to look and say, how does this work? Can this work? We don't have to go too far back into, even the history of Philadelphia to see that this was an important part of, raising the revenue that we needed as a city. So, but we could, go across the country and look at other places and other areas where, they have recognized the need to put things into place to make sure that the wealthy really are doing their fair share. Because when we have the wealthy putting a lot of money into lobbying for tax laws, it's not a big surprise that those are going to come out and be very much in their favor. And, we're not opposed to people being prosperous. We're not opposed to people increasing their wealth. This is really a basic issue of fairness and making sure that we are investing the revenue in the common good. And so, we think that, it's an idea whose time has come because we just are running out of other options in terms of how we are going to fund things.
So where does that put us now? All right. There we go. Now we haven't even discussed a couple other things we talk about on the show all the time. Redlining, the way that poor people and African American people and Latino people have been treated by the economic system, the banks, not being able to get capital. That factors into this as well, right? Because who owns the banks? Wealthy people. And there's been this systemic racism in this financial system that has created these inequities. But there's other things too, right? Just the other day, it came out that 150 million Americans, half our nation, own just 2% of the nation's wealth. Think about that for a second. Divide 2% by 150 million. What do you get? I have no idea. I can't even calculate that. That's what we're talking about.
That's a number, though.
That's the inequity we're talking about. Half the country has less than 2% of their share of the nation's wealth. Half. Meanwhile, how many millionaires became billionaires over the course of the pandemic, and how many billionaires became billionaires 10 times over during the course of the pandemic? The wealth just kept growing. For some people, the pandemic was very good business, while other people suffered. We also know that Philadelphia is the poorest big city in America, something I think we talk about almost every episode of this show. 26% poverty rate. But did you know that some sources suggest that Philadelphia is one of the top 10 wealthiest cities, not just in the country, but in the world? So we have the very wealthy and the very poor. Remember, a good portion of that 26% lives in deep poverty, which is a whole other category. That isn't even that's below the poverty level, deep poverty. And we have billionaires and millionaires that live in this city, making it one of the wealthiest cities.
What has always gotten me about that is, were you around for the Rendell administration?
At the end, yeah, I was young, but yeah.
Okay. During the Rendell administration, he campaigned as the city's cheerleader. I'm going to make the city better. I'm going to make it so, people want to come here. And they fixed up Center City. Center City was dressed to the nines, as my mom would say. Center City was decked out, new glass and new buildings and the whole bit. But if you went, it kind of reminded me of Atlanta a little bit. Downtown Atlanta is beautiful. It's glass buildings. It's all these different things. But if you go down the street from one of the streets in downtown Atlanta toward Georgia Tech, and you go underneath an underpass that separates Georgia Tech from, where Georgia Tech is kind of in the middle, and then you have like this underpass that takes you to the other side of Atlanta, you see something out of in the heat of the night. And that's what Philadelphia kind of became. You had Center City, and because I remember this, I was transferring to Temple, and I was driving down Broad Street to take my placement exams, and I'm driving down Center City. I'm like, wow, look at all these buildings, look at all this traffic, look at all these people, blah 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 blah. Then I hit North Philly. Now, it's not the same as it was when I'm driving down the street in 1987, but before the Divine Lorraine Hotel got all fixed up and everything, the section that you had to take of Broad Street that you had to take to get to Temple University looked rough, like real rough, like mug you in the daytime rough. And then all of a sudden, pow, you hit this oasis filled with big red T's. That is, I mean, if there is, that's probably the best way that we could explain the wealth disparity in Philadelphia and where it started. And it's funny that you talk about the 80s and 90s, because that was when it was at its most obvious.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're still paying the price for that today.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give you an example of inequity as we're sitting here right now, Harrisburg is sitting on a $10 billion budget surplus that is yet to be spent. I'm going to bet you that very little of that money will get to Philadelphia in one way or another.
If
That's
any.
my suspicion, if any.
If any.
And that alone, because Philadelphia is the economic generator for the entire Commonwealth. I don't think there's any disputing that. And we get something like 75 cents back. Yeah, we get something like 75 cents back for every dollar we send to the Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
Completely unfair. And that's not even getting into the rigged school funding system.
Yeah.
We can't control our own gun laws. Whatever, you name it. There's all sorts of issues here. So when we talk about asking wealthy people to pay just a little bit more, this is what we're talking about. This is the reason why. And I know that, we're supposed to be objective and all that, but when I believe that objectivity is really about being objective about the facts. And the facts are that poor people are getting screwed over and have been for decades. And really throughout the entire history of this nation. Let's be honest about that.
Well,
so now when you have the discussion is let's try to make it a little more fair. And we're not talking huge numbers here. Councilmember Brooks thinks that this could bring in $200 million to the city budget. That's a good amount of money, but when you consider a $5.4 billion budget from last year, which will probably go up this year, it's not a significant amount. It's a modest amount. And I don't think it's that much to ask.
No, but let me ask you something, Larry. Why was this a people's hearing and not an official hearing?
So,
what happened to the official hearing for this bill?
So there was a hearing scheduled for the same day this people's hearing happened. It was taken off the schedule. Now, part of the reason may have been because it was going to go before the Finance Committee, and there wasn't a chair for the Finance Committee. Councilmember Derek Green had been the chair, and he resigned to run for mayor. Councilmember Squilla has just been named chair of the Finance Committee. If this isn't given a hearing in the next month or so, we're going to know that's not the reason why. Not because there wasn't a finance chair. It's because, the powers that be aren't interested in this. But we're going to see. I'm optimistic this will get a hearing soon. But so that's what we're talking about when we talk about a wealth tax. It's not just this one single thing. It has so many layers that go back for so many years as to why this is something that needs to be considered in this city. So that's it. That's the whole thing. We had one more clip, but I'll put that on the website instead.
Okay.
Because
But
Denise, I want to talk a little bit about what you have coming up.
well, actually, I'm trying to figure out which column I'm going to write. I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to, because here are my choices. On Saturday, Democratic Senate candidate John Fetterman came to Philadelphia for a rally in West Oak Lane at a rec center so far away from Center City or even North Philadelphia that if you didn't know where you were going, you were not going to get there. But it was in West Oak Lane, and since Congressman Dwight Evans was the person sponsoring it, of course it was going to be in West Oak Lane. So I went there, and I was thinking about writing about that rally. But today started jury selection in the second trial of U.S. versus Islam et al. For those of you who are like frequent watchers of Hall Monitor, but don't know what what U.S. versus Islam et al. is, it's actually the trial of City Councilman Kenyatta Johnson. It's the retrial. If you remember back in March, they had tried the councilman, and the trial ended up in a mistrial. Because the jury couldn't come to a decision as to whether or not he, his wife Dawn Shavu, and former Universal Companies executives Raheem Islam and Shahid Dewan were guilty or not. So they're going to take. So starting today with jury selection, the second bite of the apple for the federal government to attempt to convict these folks for various acts of corruption and bribery starts this week. And I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm going to write about it or I'm going to write about the Fetterman rally. In either case, if I end up writing about the Fetterman rally, which I'm kind of leaning toward, I will definitely have something about the Johnson trial next week, because this is one of those things that could also impact what's going on in council right now. Right now, council is down to 13 people, which means there is no margin for error. Now, there's a special election coming up in November, but that's not going to solve the problem now if Councilman Johnson gets convicted. Now, he doesn't have to resign right away. He doesn't have to resign until he's sentenced if he gets convicted. But the fact is, you'll have another hole in a council that'll probably have even more holes than that by the end of the year, because not everybody who is going to run for mayor has made the decision to resign yet.
Yeah, we could still see more resignations. And the evidence, or what we've been told off the record, is that there probably will be some more resignations. Maybe from a couple different places in the city, but we'll see. So there's a long way to go before that. Next week on the program, I'm going to take you through another thing that contributes to maybe why a wealth tax isn't such a bad idea, and that's the uniformity clause in the state constitution and how that impacts taxation here in Philadelphia. We spoke to a lot of people about it. There are a lot of different takes on it, but mostly, I think most people agree that it does prohibit us from having a graduated income tax system, which could be beneficial to poorer people in the city. So we'll look forward to that next week. Thank you, Denise. Thank you to Controller Reinhardt and Jeff Carlos for being with us, and we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.